Sí, buenas tardes con todos. Muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos en esta sesión. Espero que hayan disfrutado de un extraordinario almuerzo. Siguiendo con el programa, nos corresponde ahora dar inicio a la sesión Competir hacia el primer mundo, que empezará con una conferencia muy esperada, dictada por el profesor Michael Porter. Como ustedes saben, el profesor Porter es la autoridad número 1 en estudios de competitividad en el mundo. No solo es un destacado académico de la Universidad de Harvard, sino también es un director activo en muchas empresas multinacionales y asesor de gobernantes y gobiernos del mundo en el tema de competitividad. Con esta conferencia termina de tener forma una primera y muy comprometida iniciativa del sector privado en torno a la competitividad. Este es un trabajo, como ustedes saben, que se ha desarrollado por muchos profesionales de primerísimo nivel a lo largo de muchísimos meses y constituye pues un primer gran paso de nuestro mundo empresarial, de nuestro sector privado en torno a la competitividad, y estoy seguro que sin duda esto solo es el inicio y la tarea por delante está claramente definida en función a lo que ya estamos escuchando, como todos ustedes ya lo saben. Quiero dar entonces pase al doctor Porter con su conferencia. Posteriormente tendremos el panel, la mesa de debate. Doctor Porter, once again, welcome to Peru.
Well, I am so honored to be at this incredible meeting. I've heard about Cade for many years, but this is my first time here, and I think it's particularly interesting and exciting and important that we're meeting in the Highlands, not in Lima, because I think that's part of the future of Peru. And I think it's very interesting and important that we're meeting at a public school, because I think that's part of the future of Peru. And I'm so pleased that we have so many leaders here from the private sector, from government. I'm very honored that the presidential candidates, a number of them, are here today. And I think we're here to talk about a subject that we all care about, which is how to ensure a very bright future for this country of Peru. Not just for a few people, but for all Peruvian citizens. And this is a topic and a question where really this whole process for me began 1 year ago. Some of you may have been there when I was here a year ago and talked about competitiveness. And as I was here and as I was talking to many of you about the country, about what was going on, I got a sense that there was a real opportunity to change. And as a result of that, with the help of a number of you, we have been through a process over the last 12 months of bringing together people, talking about ideas, collecting data, and trying to come up with at least a starting point for some strategic thinking and action planning for the next chapter of Peru's economic history. And it's that work that I'd like to talk about today. I don't want to imply that this work is the last word. In fact, what I'd like to suggest is this work that I'm going to present today is just the beginning of the discussion. But hopefully, all of you in Peru can have a constructive discussion about the future with a common framework and with a common set of ideas and principles for thinking about what will determine the future success of this economy. Now, I know that you've already heard from quite a few speakers during this conference, and I see that I'm having to compete a little bit with, but I'll go slow, and I'm fine. I know President Toledo a little bit. Welcome. I know you've heard from a number of other speakers, and I know that you've heard a variety of opinions, and I would like to suggest that I think you're going to find that much of what you've heard is going to be very consistent with what I have to say. But what I'm going to try to provide you in this presentation is with a lot of data and with a lot of evidence that I think hopefully will make what we know needs to be done even clearer. And we'll start to put in place some of the structure and process and goals that are necessary to move Peru forward. Just to kind of summarize what I'd like to say today, I'd like to make 6 major points. So as before we get into the details, let's just think about the big message here. The big message is we have 6 fundamental agendas in Peru. Number 1, we have to agree that it's time for the next chapter for Peru. We can't just keep repeating the last chapter and rereading the last chapter. It's time for the next chapter. And we have to figure out what the next chapter is. And in order to do that, we have to be very sophisticated because we can't do everything. So number 1, it's time for the next chapter. Number 2, we need a strategic vision for the future economy of the country that everybody understands at some level, that people can get excited about, and that will put us on that path that we all want to get to ultimately, which is a prosperous country where prosperity is shared among all the citizens. Number 3, that strategic vision is going to have a critical component, which is economic diversification. The country will not be able to be successful in the long run unless it can diversify its economy substantially, and that's going to happen in 2 basic ways. One is we're going to have to build some clusters outside of our traditional fields of expertise, and number 2, Peru is going to need to create some regional hubs besides Lima. If 5 years from now or 10 years from now all the economic activity in Peru is still mostly in Lima, we'll fail. We've got to create some other hubs, and we've got to have a strategy for doing that. So that's number 3. Number 4, in order to pursue an economic strategy for the country, we need to set some measurable goals about what we can achieve over the next 10 years or so. And I'd like to propose 11 goals. It would be nice if it was only 10. But I'm going to propose 11 goals because I think these are the right 11 goals. Now, this is not the end of the discussion. There may be 15 goals, there may be 12, there may be 10, there may be 8. But we need some clear, measurable goals that will give us a clear sense of kind of how can we tell whether we're going to make it. And so we'll talk about some goals. Number 5, what I've found is that success in economic development is partly a function of strategy, but it's just as much a function of organization, how we organize in order to actually carry out economic policy. And so I'd like to propose at least some preliminary thoughts about an organizational structure for Peru's future economic strategy. And then finally, number 6, if any of this is going to be truly successful, the private sector of Peru, you, are going to have to play a somewhat different role than you played in the past. You're going to have to do some different things. You're going to have to organize yourself in some different ways. You're going to have to broaden perhaps your field of vision. You're going to have to take on some roles that you haven't taken on before. And your willingness and ability to do that is going to have everything to do with the success of the country. These are 6 fundamental agendas that I believe are going to allow this country to achieve the promise that we all know it has. Now, I respect Al Gore a lot, but I think he was too optimistic. I don't think it's automatic that Peru is going to be successful. I think there's a great opportunity, better than most, but it's not automatic. We have to get on the same page. We have to have a strategy. We have to figure out how we're going to organize. That's going to allow this country to be successful. Now, I'm going to start in just a few moments showing you slides. And slides are both a blessing and a curse. They're a blessing because they allow you to see pictures and numbers. They're a curse because you get bogged down in them. I'm going to go through these data very quickly with you because I think it's important that you see these data. But I also want to say that these slides that I'm going to show today are going to be made available to any of you, all of you. And I would suggest that we not worry too much about covering every point, but we try to understand really the big picture. And we'll make these slides available to you. We also are preparing a written report, a paper that summarizes the work that's been done here in Peru over the last 8 to 10 months. So there's going to be lots of opportunity to look at the details. What I'm going to try to do in this presentation is kind of focus on the big messages, the big picture, show you some of the critical pieces of data, but without trying to cover everything. And that's going to mean that I might be skipping fairly rapidly over material. I hope you'll forgive me for that, but I don't want to take so much time that we kind of lose energy and that we kind of lose the big message. So let's begin. How do we think about Peru's economy? How we think about how Peru needs to go? How we think about what steps need to be taken? What should that future strategy be? How do we approach that question? Well, in order to think about the question, I think we have to sort of step back and understand kind of where is the country in its economic development. And I think most of you know the general story pretty well. This has been an economic growth success story for at least the last decade, both compared to your own history, but also in comparison to many peers. You all know this picture. This is GDP per capita, and this is how it's looked over the last 60 or 70 years in Peru. There was a history of growth, then there was a fairly long period of going in the wrong direction, and beginning in the early 90s, the country got back on the right trajectory, and we can see that progress is good today. The strength of this economy has been manifested by the degree to which you were able to deal with this economic crisis without massive disruption that we've seen in other parts of the world. In terms of GDP per capita, Peru has been growing rapidly. You're up in the better league, the big league. You're not growing as fast as China or Vietnam or India, but you've been growing pretty darn fast. And you've kind of worked your way up in terms of prosperity. You're working your way up nicely. This is enormously positive. One of the key reasons for this success has been some sound macroeconomic policies. This country has had very good macroeconomic management since the mid-90s. It's because of trade opening that you've been willing to undertake, which is scary, and many Latin American countries have had a hard time pursuing. We've also, of course, been in a very supportive international environment for most of this period until the last year or two, which has allowed growth to be a little bit easier than had been in the past. So we've got to recognize that, but there's no doubt that policies that were set worked, and they're still working, and we should be proud of that. In terms of exports, Peru is not yet a very high exporting country, given its size. But as you see here, you've been gaining world export share over the last 10 years. You've kind of worked up in terms of exports as a percentage of GDP. You're not high for a country of your size, but you're getting there. And the question is, can we keep this momentum moving? Can we keep improving the trade, the ability to export? Can we broaden that ability, as we'll see later? is critical. One of the other critical conditions for this success historically has been the ability to achieve security and stability. Political stability, economic stability, and kind of a sense of peace and security. And of course, that is no means guaranteed for the future. In fact, recently, I think the challenges are becoming even apparent again of how hard it is for a country to actually do that. All these things are good. But as we look at our performance in Peru, we all know, I hope, we all know that it's not a complete success. It's not a complete success yet, for a variety of reasons. Number one, there's been a lot of heterogeneity. Not everybody has benefited from this economic growth. And that's particularly clear, of course, when we look at things like unemployment. Given a very rapidly growing economy, it's quite surprising to see that unemployment hasn't gone down. And that's because our growth is driven by fields that don't employ a lot of people. And we haven't found a way to share that growth in more jobs in more fields. We all know that. We've made a big stab at knocking down poverty, but it's still high. And it's very heterogeneous. As we look across the country, we see enormous divergence in poverty rates in different parts of the country. We haven't managed to get a process going that is substantially reducing this disparity. And I can tell you, even from the United States experience, that unless we reduce these disparities, it's a time bomb. You'll never be successful in the long run in a democracy where you have huge disparities. We've seen it over and over again. If you don't reduce the disparities, if everybody doesn't feel like they're benefiting from economic growth, then the political process starts to work against you, not for you. Politicians then have a hard time supporting business if business is not leading to broad prosperity. And so this is a very important moment. We have to understand this lesson. We can't go through the lesson that we've seen in other Latin American countries, and I won't name any names. You all know the names, of what happens when you actually don't deal with the disparities, when you don't actually solve that problem. One of the critical issues facing their economy in Peru, you all know, which is lack of diversification, economic diversification. In a wider variety of fields, requiring a wider variety of skills, we're too dependent on a relatively small number of fields in order to drive our growth and our exports. And those fields are exposing us to a certain amount of volatility that so far has been good. You know, so far commodity prices have been good. Here they're going up again recently. But they also go down. And we know if we look over any 10-year period of history, we're going to have periods where this is a problem. And we can't get ourselves into a situation where we're so dependent on a relatively small number of fields that we can't be resilient and continue to move forward. Again, the export intensity is better, but it's still not high. The mix of exports has shifted a bit, but not that much. You can see that the big exports in 62 are pretty much still the same big exports today. Yes, we've got a bit more diversification, but not much, not enough. Not enough to move the needle in terms of employment, not enough to move the needle in terms of really spreading the economic growth across the country in an important way. If you look at the nature of our exports in Peru, we see the same picture that we've seen for many, many years. The green exports are the processed goods. And we can see that we made limited progress on exporting processed products. The blue is the services. Again, services are meaningful, but again, we've made limited progress. The big growth is in the top two, the unprocessed and the semi-processed. And that's where the real growth has come from. It's been pulling up our world export share. So again, you all know this. This is in one of our critical economic problems in this country is figuring out how to change this picture so that the pattern starts to change in a significantly different direction. It's not an unusual problem. Many resource-rich countries have this problem, but some have learned to tackle it. We have to learn to tackle it here. If we're going to achieve sustained growth going forward, we now have to tackle a whole new set of problems that are more microeconomic problems than macroeconomic problems. Macroeconomics isn't perfect. I'm worried about the credit bubble. I'm worried about all this real estate. I'm worried about it. There's still some macroeconomic issues, but the real constraints, I think, mostly are microeconomic issues, having to do with firms and regulations and markets and infrastructure and stuff like that. We also have institutional problems. Some of the critical institutions in the society are in clear need of improvement. Again, you know what many of those are, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. But we have to start tackling that institutional improvement. Because unless we can improve some of these institutions, like our education system, our healthcare system, and others, we're going to have a tough time creating the right kind of environment, with the right kind of people, with the right kind of skills, to allow us to move to higher levels of productivity and prosperity. Again, we're doing better in Peru at attracting foreign investment. And we should be proud of that. Foreign investment has been growing, but it's still very narrow. Peru is not good enough as a business environment yet to attract wide foreign investment. Yes, if you're going to do mining, you've got to come here. Mining companies will put up with almost anything to get access to the reserves. But when you talk about non-mining companies, they are more picky. They have higher standards. They're more demanding in terms of the business environment. And if we're going to keep moving this picture up and to the right, we're going to have to tackle some of these institutional and microeconomic issues. Again, we all know that. But the question is, what's our strategy? What's our plan? How are we going to get it done? And of course, all of you know that Peru is really still back at the starting line in terms of science, technology, and innovation. I find this chart pretty shocking. That in terms of patenting, innovation output, that Peru would be so weak. There's plenty of smart engineers here. There's lots of Peruvians that are good scientists. Some of them working in Peru and some of them working elsewhere. But we haven't managed to create the right set of institutions within Peru to allow us here to really drive technological progress and innovation. And we know that eventually that will become the key constraint. It's not the constraint yet. We can improve standard of living here in Peru for quite a while without having to have scientific innovation. But we have to put in place the assets and the resources necessary because it takes a long time. Probably takes 20 years or so to build a sort of an science and technology system. And so we have to get started on that, fairly soon if we're going to have one by the time we need it later on. So I guess the bottom line here is, yes, we can sustain 8 to 9% growth. No reason why this country can't sustain it. But in order to do so, we've got to improve our competitiveness. And that's why we're all here. And this is a topic and a theme that I think has been covered, repeatedly already in this conference. What I hope we can do in this session is to put some flesh, anyway, on the bones of, okay, how would we go about doing that? What would that look like? What might be a vision? With the understanding that, again, nobody like me can be the last word. All we can do is start the discussion. But we have to create the right process to carry on that discussion and put it into practice. I believe, as I said a minute ago, that Peru needs really to have an economic strategy. We can't just have a list of policies that we want to improve. We can't just have a list of weaknesses. We need an affirmative strategy. We need a statement of where we want to go in this country, where we can be really competitive. What are the real assets and strengths that we have to build upon? You know, what I found is you can't build an economy that's successful just by reducing weaknesses. To build a successful economy, you have to find your inherent strengths and build up those. And so we need a strategy. We need a strategy that can focus us on what are the most important issues. Can't tackle everything. We need a strategy that kind of chooses where we can really succeed, not tries to compete across the board. We need a strategy that has an action plan and an organizational structure. And we need a strategy around which we can build a broad consensus. There's always going to be things to debate and discuss in any society. There's going to be differences of opinion about many issues. Peru will be successful when there's an agreement on the core of an economic vision, and the disagreement is more about the details of how do you do it. That's what we found in country after country. What we find is successful countries are those when a new government comes in, there are differences, of course, but the basic core economic path is consistent. That's what we have to achieve. That's what I think we have the opportunity to achieve in Peru, and that's what we'll be talking about here in this session. What might that look like? What are the things that we can agree on that make sense? And then how can we kind of get everybody on the same page and doing their part? Now, over the last 8 months or so, I have had the privilege of leading a very interesting process. And I'll tell you that I've never actually been involved in a process like this anywhere else in the world. I've worked at the highest levels in 25 or 30 countries on economic strategy, but the process here was really quite unusual. It started with some private sector leaders who were willing to kind of step up and see if they could sort of nurture a new dialogue, collect some facts, bring our knowledge together. And those private sector leaders, I think, should be congratulated for their vision and their forward-looking investments. We put together a very interesting group of people. You can see here there was an advisory board, which some of you served on, to kind of provide the reality check, make sure this wasn't just, kind of an exercise. We have a joint team with a bunch of Peruvians and a few of us non-Peruvians. I think there's only 2 non-Peruvians, myself and Professor Jorge Ramirez from your neighbor, Colombia, who's my colleague of many, many years. This team, I think, developed a tremendous spirit and pulled together a tremendous amount of interesting work. The team interviewed dozens and dozens of people, I think at least 100 people. Many of you are sitting in this room, from all parts of the society, about the future of the economy, about competitiveness issues, about what needed to be done. The team organized itself into a number of broad categories: macroeconomics, business environment, cluster development, and organization structure. How would we actually get this done? And you can see some of the critical subtopics that were explored. In one case, the team actually worked with a specific cluster in Peru. It was actually the metal mechanic cluster in Lima, because we wanted to actually try to work together on a collaborative process of building competitiveness in a particular field, just to see how hard it was in Peru, to help us understand better what some of the obstacles might be to actually making economic changes bottoms up, not just top down. Again, that's another characteristic of all really successful countries. Everything isn't top down, it's also bottoms up. Lots of people are involved in changing and improving and doing things. We don't just wait for political leaders to have to do everything. And we wanted to kind of see what the bottoms-up process might look like. This project conducted a survey. And this just gives you, some of the basic data. This was a significant, thoughtful survey about competitiveness issues to very senior people in a whole bunch of companies distributed across the country. We could have surveyed more. But I think it gave us a very good flavor for what sort of the general views were about what the real problems really were. And it was a very interesting part of our process. So what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about what we learned, but then hopefully as quickly as possible, what we would suggest, based on this group's effort, really needs to be done in terms of direction. But before we do that, I think we all have to get, at some level, on the same page about competitiveness. If the goal is to improve the competitiveness of Peru, what do we mean by competitiveness? And what do we understand are the fundamental drivers of competitiveness? Because if we're going to make progress, we have to kind of have a frame of reference about what are the key causes, what are the key issues. Now again, many of you have heard me speak before, so this is not going to be anything new. Because the fundamentals of competitiveness are timeless. Competitiveness depends on the productivity of the economy. The output that can be produced with a day of work, or